You are listening to An Affair of Glass, a short story curated and presented by The Talking Book, your daily stop for stories. The first lie was small enough to fit under Mara's tongue. "I'm staying late," she told Elliot, her phone wedged between her shoulder and ear as she searched for her keys. "Budget review. You know how it is." She said it like it was the weather, unfortunate, unavoidable, nobody's fault. Elliot made a sympathetic sound, the kind he'd learned over years of being married to someone whose calendar always looked like a Tetris game on hard mode. "Want me to start dinner?" he asked. "I'll grab something," Mara replied, already stepping into the hallway where the building smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old mail. "Don't wait up." She hung up before his silence could ask another question. Outside, January pressed its cold palm to the city. The streetlights were a soft orange blur through a fine mist, and the sidewalks shone as if freshly varnished. Mara walked fast, not because she was late, but because slowing down made room for thinking. By the time she reached the station, her heart had settled into a steady, guilty rhythm, thump, thump, as if keeping time for a song she didn't know the words to. Jonas stood near the big clock, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the arrivals board like it might spell out the future in delayed departures. He was dressed the way he always was at work, simple, careful, like someone who didn't want his personality to take up too much space. But outside the office, with his hair a bit damp from the fog and his cheeks pink from the cold, he looked startlingly human. When he saw her, he didn't wave. He just smiled as if they were already halfway through a conversation. "You made it," he said. Mara forced herself to smile back, to behave like this was normal, like she wasn't holding her marriage like a glass she'd begun to drop. "I said I would," she replied, and immediately hated how much she liked the sound of certainty in her own voice. They walked without touching. It was a rule they hadn't spoken aloud. In public, they kept a respectful space between them, two colleagues who happened to be traveling in the same direction. On the train, they sat apart, separated by a couple of strangers and a pole that smelled faintly of metal and hands. Mara watched Jonas's reflection in the dark window as the city slid past, his profile blurring and sharpening with every tunnel light. It was absurd, the way something could be both thrilling and pathetic, like a teenager hiding cigarettes in a winter coat. And yet, at the museum, the air was warm and dry, the kind of warmth that made Mara suddenly aware of her damp hair, her cold fingers. Jonas bought their tickets without asking if she wanted to split it. Another unspoken thing, his insistence on small acts of care that felt in their quiet way intimate. They wandered through rooms of framed oceans, fractured faces, landscapes painted in impossible colors. Mara tried to pay attention, to let her mind be filled with brushstrokes and history and the hum of other visitors. But her awareness kept tilting toward Jonas, the way he leaned in to read a plaque, the way his hands moved when he spoke, as if he were shaping thoughts in the air. They stopped in front of a painting that looked like a storm held in place, thick grey swirls, a slash of white, a horizon line barely surviving. Jonas stared at it for a long time. "It makes me feel relieved," he said finally, as if confessing to a crime. Mara glanced at him. "Relieved? Like someone else understands what it's like to have a lot going on inside and not have a clean way to say it." Mara's laugh came out too sharp. She swallowed. "That's a dangerously accurate sentence." Jonas looked at her then, not at the painting. The crowd moved around them like water around stones. "I didn't mean—" "You did," Mara interrupted softly. She couldn't help it. For weeks, their conversations had been shaped like this, turning and turning until they were suddenly about her, about the way she always had an answer at work and none at home, about the way she felt like she'd become an efficient version of herself, streamlined for bills and errands and dinner plans. Elliot was kind. Elliot was reliable. Elliot could predict what kind of yogurt she wanted without asking. Elliot also hadn't looked at her like Jonas was looking at her now, in a way that made her feel seen rather than managed for a long time. "I'm sorry," Mara said, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. Coming, wanting, being this person. Jonas's expression softened. "Don't be." They left the museum after closing, stepping into the night where the city felt sharper, louder. The street vendors were packing up. A bus sighed at the curb. Someone laughed too brightly outside a bar, a sound that carried in the cold air. Jonas led her. Down a side street lined with small shops. There was a cafe still open, warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. They went in and chose a table in the back, near a window that fogged at the edges. They talked about harmless things first, a new policy at work, a co-worker's habit of microwaving fish. Mara laughed more easily than she had all day. Jonas's eyes crinkled at the corners when she did, like laughter physically reshaped him. Then silence fell, the kind that didn't feel awkward so much as inevitable. Mara stared at her cup, at the thin ring of foam clinging to the rim. "This is not who I thought I was," she said. Jonas didn't pretend not to understand. "Me either." She looked up. "Then why are we here?" For a moment, Jonas said nothing. He seemed to consider the question with care, as if he didn't want to cheapen it with a quick answer. Finally, he exhaled. "Because when I'm with you, I don't feel like I'm performing my life," he said. "I feel like I'm living it." Mara's throat tightened. The words were too close to something she'd never allowed herself to say out loud. Because when she was with Jonas, she wasn't an organizer or a fixer or the one who remembered birthdays and car insurance and the name of their neighbor's dog. She was simply a woman sitting at a table, her hands wrapped around something warm, with a man across from her who asked questions and waited for real answers. "That's not fair," she whispered. "I know." Jonas's voice was low. "I'm not proud of any of this." Mara watched a couple at the counter, their shoulders touching as they looked at a menu. Something simple and honest about it stabbed her. She felt an ache for that kind of ease, for love without barbed wire. She forced herself to meet Jonas's gaze. "Do you ever think about what it's doing to them?" she asked. "To Elliot, to your life too." Jonas flinched slightly, as if she'd pressed on a bruise. "All the time." Mara's phone buzzed, a sound that seemed too loud in the cafe's soft hum. She didn't need to look to know it was Elliot. He texted like clockwork when she was late, a check-in, a heart emoji, sometimes a photo of whatever he was eating because he thought it would make her smile. Her hand hovered over the phone. Jonas didn't move, didn't look away, as if he understood that the device was suddenly a doorway. Mara picked it up. "You okay?" Elliot's message read, "I saved you some soup." Mara pictured him at home, the kitchen light on, the television low, his glasses on the coffee table. She pictured the small, domestic things that made up their life. Her mug in the drying rack, his shoes by the door, the framed photo of them on a hike years ago when they both looked sunburnt and breathless and impossibly young. A rush of affection surged through her, fierce and painful. Not the bright kind she'd felt when she was 25, and everything was a first, but the sturdy kind built from thousands of ordinary days. She looked at Jonas, and the warmth she felt for him didn't vanish. It was still there, humming under her skin, undeniable. The problem was that two truths could exist at once. "I should go," she said, her voice trembling on the edges. Jonas's face closed for a fraction of a second, something like disappointment crossing it. But then he nodded, slow and steady. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Outside, the air slapped her cheeks. The cold felt like punishment and clarity all at once. They walked back toward the station, their steps in sync without effort. At the entrance, the crowd swallowed them. People rushed for trains, faces set with purpose. The big clock above the platforms ticked along, indifferent to human mess. They stopped near the pillar where they'd first met, as if this spot had become their unofficial beginning and end. Jonas spoke first. "Mara." She lifted a hand, not to silence him, but to hold the moment still. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. Jonas's eyes glistened, though he didn't blink too much. "Neither do I." For a heartbeat, they stood so close she could feel his breath. The world narrowed to the space between them. Jonas leaned in gently, like asking permission. Mara let her forehead rest briefly against his, a contact so small it could be denied, yet it carried the weight of everything. "I don't want to be the thing that breaks you," Jonas murmured. Mara swallowed hard. "You're not." That wasn't entirely true. Or perhaps it was. Perhaps the breaking was already inside her, a fault line she'd been walking over for years without noticing. The train announcement crackled overhead. Jonas took a step back, hands clenched at his sides, as if he were physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "Go," he said, voice rough. "Before I make it harder." Mara nodded. She turned toward the platform, then stopped and looked back. Jonas stood where she'd left him, a solitary figure under the clock, the city's light reflecting off the wet floor at his feet. He didn't wave. He just watched her, his expression a quiet mixture of longing and resignation. Mara stepped onto the train. As the doors closed, her reflection appeared in the window, a woman with wide eyes and damp hair and a mouth set in a line, like she was trying not to fall apart in public. She typed a response to Elliot with fingers that shook. On my way. Then, after a pause that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, we need to talk when I get home. The message sent. The train lurched forward. Mara watched the station slide away, the lights blurring into streaks. Somewhere behind her, Jonas became a smaller and smaller point in the night until he was gone entirely. She pressed her palm to the cool glass and tried to breathe, her heart hurt in every direction at once. For the first time in months, maybe years, she understood with terrifying clarity that wanting something wasn't the same as choosing it. And that choice, whatever it would be, was waiting at the end of the line.